Shaking his head with a sigh, he would glance between the two last doors. The priest's. Something that Angelo could never quite get behind. The one place Angelo had yet to set foot in the entire academy, in fact. Even with the fun possibility of tainting the pretty little hen cleric of Tyr, he had yet to change the idea and enter. Some things just weren't worth it. Temporal and prayer, those were listed under things not worth it. No pretty face was worth dealing with such things in his eyes. Still, peeking inside, he couldn't help but curse himself a bit. She was quite the pretty little thing, after all. Tabitha, he believed her name was. Though, as he began to close the door again, he caught the shine of a gemstone near the desk on the other side of the room. Torn between something that glitters, a pretty face, and his sanity, Angelo stood at the entrance of the door. Ignoring the foolish priest, he had no desire to talk to any of them. He instead decided to slip along the side. The other two were far too busy practicing their spells. Though the pretty little hen did give him a look, sadly he wasn't interested. Something about a woman that served a deity just rubbed him the wrong way. Sliding over toward the desk and carefully placing himself behind the blonde fool that was subbing? Removing? It was hard to tell. Magic was never his preference when it came to the divine. Instead, he examined the two items inside. Another scroll and a ruby, the shine that had caught his eye from the top of the desk. Carefully pocketing it with a bit of sleight of hand, slipping it into his sleeve, he instead gave a show, glancing over the scroll before taking it, and muttering something about returning it to Jeru, quickly exiting the room before they decided he wanted to pray. With his treasure obtained, he would walk casually towards his main goal, Keta. He'd paid the woman a nice fee in order to get information on where they had put his damn equipment. Whether or not she had information or not, it was still worth talking to her. Still, unfortunately, he and Keta were not to interact as if they knew one another. It was important. After all, they had to act like total strangers because no one could know of their connection to the black market. For one, it could cost her her job. On two, it would put a very dark shine on his trust, as they put it, that he was desperately trying to build up so he could get out of this damned building. Stepping towards Keta, he would casually interact with her. After all,
Hi there.
they were friends,
Head of
even
security,
if they couldn't act
espionage,
it.
and intrigue here at the Academy. No need to tell me who you are. My sources are way ahead of you.
Just as she normally would, she introduced herself as if they'd first met, and that was perfect by him. Now I know you're not one of those prissy types who frowns on a little sneaky skullduggery. I mean, that's why you're here, ain't it? To learn the ins and outs of the rogue's life. Well, don't worry, you've come to the best. I know all the tricks of the trade, and I'm going to teach them to you. Keta and him both knew that he was better than her at it. Still, this was their roles, and he knew he must play along. I'm going to skip the tutorial bits once more. Having given him his little assignment to attain the key, Angelo casually moved forward. There were several options here, and he noticed the trap right away, a simple spring mechanism, not really worth his time. The lock, he assumed, was very similar in that, though he had no desire to talk to the orc. Bruno? Who in the hell named their children Bruno? Ugh. Shaking his head in amusement, he would walk towards the trap. Easily the most simple of the issues. All he needed was the stupid little key to offer to Keta, and in return she could give him the information he was after without causing any suspicion. A single flick of his wrist, and a few motions, the trap was disarmed, and he was in. The rope key was simple to obtain, as he had assumed. Returning to Keto,
I see you've got
he would
the
offer
key
the
on
key.
you. Well done. Let me be the first to congratulate you. Your work here at the Academy is all but done.
As a reward for completing your training, let me give you this gift. After all, what's the point of doing something if you don't get a reward in the end, right? The spike traps were not unwanted, but he had little use for them, and it would be difficult to find a merchant that would purchase them. Most saw traps and decided they wanted nothing to do with you. Understandable, but frustrating. But what was much more important was the note tucked into one of those trap kits. That was the information Angelo was far more concerned with. A simple movement, and it would be tucked into his sleeve, just like the ruby. Sleight of hand was his specialty, after all. Now, unless there was something else you needed, you had better get down to the South Assembly Hall if you want to get that blessing from Lady Arabeth. A silent message, and one Angelo understood all the well, bidding the woman farewell. Angelo would of course read the note, but not yet. For one, it would be far too obvious. For two, there was a pretty little elf in the corner that had caught his eye.
Looking for a good time?
Hello, Angelo. You don't know me, but you can just call me Silk. Intrigued, Angelo would arch a brow. It was true, he didn't know her. But he was curious how she knew him. Few people paid attention to him. Yes, he was one of the senior students, but there were several others, and he had done his best to keep a low profile, well, besides that naked incident. Don't worry, it's nothing sinister, just a little harmless spying on my part. Keta says I need to practice my espionage skills. I've been watching you for quite some time. But now that you're almost done with your training here at the Academy, I'm going to need to find someone else to spy on. Maybe Lady Arabeth would be a nice target. Angelo is somewhere between uncertain, disturbed, and excited. As one would expect, he supposed. If a beautiful lady was spying on you, you would most likely feel the same. Curious, however, more about himself than Lady Arabeth, but it was a start. If you're going to spy on someone, it might as well be someone in charge, right? Arabeth knows a lot about this plague that she's letting on. You can't blame me for being curious. Of course, if I get caught, they'll probably expel me, or worse, but the danger is part of the appeal. Besides, maybe I'll finally figure out why so many men seemed infatuated with that woman. Angelo couldn't help but chuckle. It was true, Arabeth was absolutely stunning, but once more, he didn't fiddle with women that tended to prefer the help of the deities. It was unattractive for one, and for two, well, the gods seemed not to like him too much. The divines in general seemed to have it out for him, in fact. Still, there was a way to do this. He could poke the bear and tease her a bit, or he could redirect the conversation to something less intriguing. Angelo was much more curious about her than the plague. He decided to poke the bear. After all, what was the harm in a little bit of teasing? Let's just say I'm confused. Why would anyone be interested in that paladin? Honor, duty, virtue, boring. What's the appeal? Don't men want a woman who's a little bit mysterious? Tell me the truth, Angelo. What do you want in a woman? A goody-two-shoes paladin, or someone a bit naughty? A girl who knows secrets? A woman who's dangerous? Angelo would allow a smirk to play at his lips. The other two women that he'd interacted with, and, well, the others that he probably had but couldn't remember, had been all targets that he had found appealing and approached. But this woman was different. She had been interested in him to begin with, and, more importantly, had been watching him without him noticing. That was something that very much intrigued him. Plus, he agreed with her views. Who in the hell wanted a paladin as a wife? Well, who really wanted a wife in general? Thoughts for later. I have to confess that since I started spying on you, I've become a little bit obsessed. Hazard of the job, I guess. I couldn't help wondering what it would be like to know you more intimately. You'll be leaving the academy soon. Why don't we get together tonight? After the graduation ceremonies, just the two of us. You can learn some of my secrets for a change. Angelo struggled to hold back a wolfish smirk, and instead allowed that charming smile to form on his features. I promise it will be an evening you'll remember for the rest of your life. I won't say anything more. Best let the mystery and anticipation build up. Is there anything else I can do for you? Angelo, far too high on the excitement of what was to come, didn't even consider the concept of asking her about rumors that she might have picked up. As skilled a spy as she was, he would probably regret that decision. Instead, excusing himself and informing her he looked forward to the night. I'll see you after the feast then. Don't worry. I promise tonight will be the most memorable evening of your life. Angelo did ponder about that. Still, a cheerful whistle would fall from his lips. It would seem, even after the guard's idiocy, that Angelo was going to have some silk in his bed after all. Moving out the door, Angelo would halt. That note still was important, and though he was thrilled with the idea of silk, he still needed to read it. Carefully slipping into the shadows and falling back, he would lean against a door that remained sealed, and would carefully open the page. The letter in question that Keta had left him was intriguing, to say the least, and frustrating in others. Annoyingly, it would seem that all of his things had been taken to a warehouse in the Beggar's Nest, a shipping company of some sort. Made sense, but was infuriating. After all, that meant there would be no way for him to get to it for quite a while. Forced with this, Angelo would sigh and tuck the paper away. Even with that, his inventory had been at least moved to somewhere that he could reach eventually. And, importantly, he now knew exactly where, and that information was key. If he knew where, he could break in. If he break in, well, he could obtain his items once more. He made a note to give Keta an extra kiss next time, and perhaps less handcuffs. It was a reward worth it for the information she'd managed to acquire for him. With a sigh, he would push himself off the door, resigned to his fate of having this drab, annoying equipment for at least now, and instead would move toward the door. With his final trial complete, Angelo doesn't even acknowledge the guard standing in his way. Instead, opening the door, or not. Moving towards the door and attempting to open it, he would glare at it. Why on earth were all the doors in this damned academy locked? Sighing and turning towards the guard that had a smug expression that he wanted to smack right off his face.
Now that you've finished your training, you can go on into the South Assembly Hall if you want. Lady Arabeth is still granting blessings to all the Academy graduates.
Go on into the assembly hall whenever you're ready. Giving the man a glare that would melt diamond, Angelo would turn and move back towards the door as he'd been intending to in the first damn place. Releasing a sigh and moving forward, he glanced around at all the other graduates. Some looked to have some potential at least, but most all just appeared to be run-of-the-mill individuals. Confident and happy, certainly, but none of them appeared as if they would last. Foolish children that were in over their heads. And at the center of it all, the glowing beacon that was Lady Arabeth de Tilbaran. Smirking at her, he would walk right past initially. Pocketing the items inside, she made no comment, pretending that she hadn't even noticed, and as he turned once more to face her, she would pretend as if they hadn't even met, which was, sadly, exactly what he had anticipated. After all, couldn't have all the students knowing that she'd hired in, effectively at least, though there was no pay in his pockets, a renegade pirate.
Congratulations! Your training here at the Academy is now complete. May the blessing of Tyr be upon you. I have been looking forward to meeting you. The instructors here at the Academy speak very highly of your skills. I am Lady Arabeth de Tilmarand. Perhaps after the graduation ceremonies, we can speak in private. Neverwinter can use someone like you. We should arrange to... Wait, what was that? Did you feel it? Brace yourself, we are under attack.
Angelo halted. Feel what? And then it hit him. Though he lacked Lady Arabeth's idiotic divine senses, he had something better, a sixth sense that knew exactly what was going to happen. Danger.
We are under attack! Destroy the invaders!
Alright, so 4 mages. Without hesitation, Angelo's blade would already be in his hand. A single motion, and flames would erupt from his palm, wrapping around the blade. And then he was off. Arabeth would need no assistance. But saving the foolish children that had thought themselves heroes was a good step.
Time to die!
He wasn't one to just stand there and allow them to die. His blade bit into flesh, and his flames seared the wounds shut. A single flick of his wrist was all it took. 2 down by his hand. And the last, down by Arabeth's own. The students had managed to use a bit of a sneak attack using sleep spells. But as he calmed, he realized there were only 3 left. How fragile they must have been. And as he glanced at the dying bodies, and Arabeth repeatedly called for his aid, he felt a sinking in his stomach. This was been intended as his final day here. A single smooth motion, she could give him his stupid little blessing, and he could be out the door and looking for his father. Instead, 4 innocents had been killed because he'd been too slow. He shouldn't feel guilty about that. But he did.
Listen to me! There is not much time. I fear this is no random attack we have suffered. As you may already know, a number of creatures were brought from Waterdeep here to the Academy. It was believed the reagents for a spell to create a cure could be extracted from them. We tried to keep this information secret, but this attack reveals our secret is well known, even to our enemies.
Angelo released a slow breath, because it was exactly as he had expected. The flames rippled along his blade, but Arabeth paid it no mind, much as she didn't even glance at his hair or eyes when they had first met. And Angelo felt guilty for that, because it showed to her character. She was not judging him. She was not assuming anything. And yet, he had let her people die. And yet, He had not moved fast enough, and yet the hair still stood up on the backs of his skin. His arms shivered with goosebumps. Danger was near, and he couldn't tell if it was fear for his own safety or the fear for others, and that sensation was something he was not used to. Releasing a breath and leveling his head, he moved forward with the conversation. There was important information that they needed to know. Whatever was going on, he had to solve it. Glancing at the dead bodies and the empty eyes that stared at him, he knew that much.
Neverwinter has many enemies. Some declare themselves openly, such as the city of Luskan. Others keep their identities hidden from us, striking from the shadows. I do not know who is behind this attack, but it is obvious they are here to destroy our hope of ending the Wailing Death.
That much was clear, but the question was something much more. Because to Angelo, the only people who would wish to stop a cure from forming are the people who would initiate the death in the first place. Instead of killing those mages, you should have kept them alive. Information was key.
You must protect the Watadavian creatures. They must not be allowed to fall into the enemy's hands.
The fact that reagents were coming from creatures was odd. Alchemy was a powerful thing, but in the end, it was nothing so substantial that it could end an entire disease. He pondered curiously just what these creatures were, but he had little time.
I would take you to the creatures myself if I could, but I fear my presence would make protecting the creatures more difficult, if not impossible.
Angelo halted, contemplating that, before he realized she was likely right. Though he was here, he was not a beacon. He doubted that many, beyond Arabeth and Lord Nasher and a few of the instructors, really knew who he was. Which meant that these attackers were focused on something else, and teleportation was not a simple spell, you needed an anchor. Arabeth was likely that anchor.
Our attackers appeared here in this room. It is likely their arrival was magically centered on me. They must have assumed I would be with the Watadavian creatures.
Proved correct, Angelo would simply nod. It was a fair assessment, after all. Amusingly, the only reason she wasn't was because she was here greeting him. That had been the entire point of this endeavor. In a twisted way, Angelo had saved the creatures already, but they were not out of the woods yet.
Even now, our enemy may be watching me through magical means, hoping I will lead them right to where the creatures are kept. I cannot take that risk.
Here, Angelo had to question her sanity. Or at least her decision-making skills. As yes, there was a risk of this, but if they could watch her, they were watching him as well. They would just follow him instead. Despite this, there was some degree of sense to it, as if they sent him, they would likely not think anything of a student, and the actual defensive power, or offensive power, however you wish to look at it, would be much less. Perhaps he could use that to his advantage and cut his way through more efficiently. And on the other hand, that meant that Arabeth would likely suffer many attacks here. He had to ponder the safety of the last few students that remained. But that was not his job. His job were the creatures. And though the bodies still stared at him silently, he knew what he had to do at this point. He was no hero, but he did believe in debts. And right now he owed a debt to the dead. He owed them this much, at the very least, to make sure that those deaths were not in vain.
You must do this alone. Go back through the hallway leading to this room, and take the corridor to the east. It leads to the chambers where the Watadavian beasts are being kept.
Though he wouldn't say it like this, he would agree.
Take this key. It will open the locked east door back in the hallway leading to this room. I will stay here. Hopefully my presence will draw the enemy away from the creatures they seek.
A silent agreement to her statement, he took the key and turned. How ironic that the door he just leaned against had been one that, amusingly, was the next step in his little adventure, if he even dared think of something like this as an adventure. Suddenly, glancing at the bodies, Angelo missed the roaring sea. At least a hurricane was something he knew how to deal with. But plague, mass death, and debts to the dead, those weren't things that he took as easily.
Hurry! Make your way into the hall, and then to the chambers down the east corridor. That is where the Watadavian beasts are kept. The fate of Neverwinter depends on you. This key will open the door. May Tyr be with you.
Clearly ruffled, she had replied and stated the same thing several times. But Angelo was in no mood to make fun of it. No longer. Releasing a breath, he moved forward and began. He had limited time.
What's this? I was expecting Arabeth, not some wet bastard. Let's see how you deal.
Without hesitation, spotting the enemy, Angelo's reflexes kicked in. Attacking on sight without mercy or hesitation, he cut into the man, landing 2 deadly attacks before he teleported away. Whoever this mage was, he wasn't a pushover. Next came something much more risky. He had a choice now. Did he try and save others? Did he even dare and check to see if others had been attacked? Were there more mages? The goblins that had been summoned were easily dealt with, but more mages were not so easy. His mind flashed towards Silk, and finally he decided that he had to at least try. Shifting into the shadows and silently opening the door, and then, to his surprise, found that the fools actually managed to catch him, one right by the door. As soon as it had opened, they'd spotted him. Still, he made short work of them. No mages, just goblins. His blade spun and cut through them like butter. And then he felt his heart drop. Dead. All of them were dead. Keta, who had been one of the few friends that he actually had in the academy. They'd had fun together, certainly, but it was more than that. They'd had similarities of pasts. They had similar views. And here she was, magical blast scorching her frame. What was left of little Hin was long, long gone. Setting his jaw, Angelo moved forward. The foolish orc. Foolish, but certainly didn't deserve death at such a young age. Much like the elf that had been training in the back, he hadn't even passed him a glance. And now those dead white eyes stared up at him, and he realized he didn't even know the elf's name. Angelo was a pirate. He'd seen death before, he'd killed before. But something of this scale was different. And as he approached Silk's body, he felt something in his chest burn. He'd barely known the woman. They'd just promised a fling. It was nothing important, nothing special. And yet, this is what burned. Because to him, all she had been was a pair of legs, and a pretty face, and a bit of an interesting personality. A fling, a conquest, a bit of fun on the side. And now she was dead. She was dead, and he was angry at himself. She hadn't deserved this, and he'd barely known her. He couldn't say that for certain, but she was too young. They'd all been too young. He'd scorned them all, even stating that. But he hadn't realized the full weight of his statement until this point, standing alone amongst the bodies. And in this moment, Angelo would realize that he was more than a debt. Silk's eyes stared up into his own, and guilt burned in his chest, but so did anger. Because he'd been young once, and he had been abandoned, and he had been surrounded by the dead. And Vengal had saved him from that. And he had met many men and many people in his life. And he knew the type that could do something like this. And no one deserved it. Releasing a slow breath, he turned from the bodies and made a silent promise to himself. Whoever did this would pay. Whoever did this would be stopped. Because he could not allow someone else to become like him, to experience the things he had. And he could not allow more youths to be cut down before they'd even managed to live. No more. And if that meant he had to put Vengal's hunt on hold, then so be it. As much as he loved his father was far more competent and far more likely to be alive in this scenario than these foolish children that had no chance in the first place. Angelo didn't bother with the other rooms. He could feel it. They were dead. All of them were dead. And every snide remark, every sarcastic comment, every jab and bitter mockery echoed through his mind. And so did the screams that he knew they must have made as they fell. In the end, he would have to live with that guilt the rest of his life, he supposed. Releasing a slow breath, his hand lifted, and he pushed the doors open after sliding in the key. Forward. Always forward, just as Vengal had taught him.